Somewhere under 200 feet of green water north of Atlanta, there are headstones still standing that no one ever agreed to move. The families said no, or the families could not be found. When the water rose over this valley in the 1950s, it rose over the graves anyway, and it has never given them back. Every summer, more than 10 million people come to this lake to swim and fish and celebrate on the surface of it. Almost none of them know that the ground beneath their boats holds a cemetery, a racetrack, a church, and the bones of a town. And almost none of them know the one thing that matters most about this place. The story you have heard about this water has the order of events wrong. People will tell you they flooded a black town here, and that the anger of the drowned is the reason the lake takes so many. The truth is heavier than that, and it does not need a single ghost. What happened here happened on dry land, in daylight, in front of thousands of people, more than 40 years before the dam was ever built. The water came last. This is Lake Lanier. On a map, it looks like recreation. 59 square miles of shoreline, boat docks, a poet's name on a state park. It was built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, authorized by Congress, and filled to full pool in the summer of 1958 behind a wall of concrete called Buford Dam. Everything about it is documented, down to the day the dam closed and the survey of the valley they flooded. That is what unsettles people who look into it. None of what follows is a rumor. It sits in the public record. Two things about this water sit at the center of it. One is what the lake is hiding down in the dark, the reason it drowns more people than any other lake in Georgia. The other is what men did on this ground long before any water covered it, the crime the lake was poured on top of. Hold on to both, because most people only ever hear half of one of them. Let me start with the water itself, because that is where the fear starts for the people who live here. Ask anyone in North Georgia, and they will tell you Lanier is dangerous. They will tell you it takes people every single summer. And the numbers the Department of Natural Resources actually keeps are grim enough that no one has to exaggerate them. Since 1994, at least 160 people have died on this lake. In 1 year alone, 2016, 17 people lost their lives here, 9 of them by drowning. Across one 5-year stretch, this single lake accounted for nearly half of every drowning at 8 major state lakes combined. That is a body count the state writes down summer after summer. And those are only the deaths the state has tallied since the mid-1990s. Go back to the day the lake was filled, and the estimates climb into the hundreds. Somewhere between 500 and 700 lives, by various accounts in the press, though no agency has ever kept a full record across all those decades. The exact figure is one more thing about this lake that no one can quite pin down. What no one argues about is how often it happens. And the cruelty of it is how gentle the lake looks while it does the taking. On a summer afternoon, there is no kinder water in Georgia. Pontoon boats on the coves, children off the end of a dock, sun scattered across the surface. But that surface hides what lies under it. A few feet down, the warm water gives way to a layer cold enough to lock a strong swimmer's chest, and the old river channel still cuts deep trenches through the lake bed where the bottom drops away without warning. A man wades off a sandbar, takes one more easy step, and finds nothing under his foot. The lake that looked like a postcard at noon is the same lake that pulls him down, and it does not wait for dark to do it. Most of the people it takes could swim. They trusted a calm the water never really had. So people reach for a story to explain it. They say the lake is haunted. But sit with the man who has actually gone down into that water to bring the dead back up, and you get a different answer. And it is somehow worse. The recovery divers who work Lanier describe going down into near total darkness. The water is stained and cold and thick with silt, and past a certain depth, they cannot see their own hands in front of them. So they search the bottom by feel. One of them described what that is like. You reach out into the black, he said, and you feel an arm or a leg, and it does not move. Now ask why the visibility is so bad, and why the bottom snags people the way it does, and you reach the real reason, the physical one. When the Corps flooded this valley, they did not scrape it clean. They took the houses that could be moved, but under the surface, they left a whole landscape behind. Roadbeds still run along the lake floor. The foundations of homes sit where families left them. Whole stands of timber were left standing, drowned trees reaching up toward the boats. And in one place, they left an entire racetrack. The old Gainesville Speedway went under with the rest of the valley. For 50 years, families water skied over the top of it without knowing. Then, in the drought of 2007, the water dropped so far that the concrete grandstand of the speedway broke back through the surface into the daylight. Rows of empty seats looking out over water where a racetrack used to be. The speedway was only the piece that came all the way back. Down the old river channel, there are bridges the roads no longer need. The brick chimneys of houses whose walls are long gone. The footings of a mill. The roofline of a barn. When a hard drought pulls the lake down, the drowned valley climbs partway back into the light, and boaters drift over foundations they never knew were there. Then the rains return, and the water closes over all of it again. That is what waits on the bottom of Lanier, a drowned world with hard edges, in water no one can see through, under one of the most crowded lakes in the American South. It does not take a haunting to explain the rest. Put 100,000 swimmers over a submerged town every weekend, and the water will take its share of them. And it has taken some in ways people never forget. In the spring of 1958, before the lake had even finished filling, two young women named Delia Mae Parker Young and Susie Roberts left a dance in Dawsonville and drove off into the night. Their car ran off the end of a bridge and into the new water. The next year, a body surfaced, missing its hands and feet, and could not be identified. People began to talk about a lady of the lake, a woman in a blue dress seen out on the water after dark. The woman in the blue dress is folklore. But what happened to Susie Roberts is documented down to the year. She and her 1950s Ford were not found in 1959. They were not found for 32 years. It took until 1990, when crews working on the bridge finally located the car on the bottom, with her remains still inside it, where the lake had held her for 3 decades. That is the water and what it hides. Keep it in mind, because all of it, the graves, the darkness, the way the lake holds what it takes, points backward to what this valley was before the core ever arrived. And that story is the one they leave off the state park brochure. Before I take you back there, let me say one plain thing. If you want the truth about these southern waters told straight, without the invented ghosts and the easy answers, the best thing you can do is follow along. The stories do not run out. This land has kept too many of them. Now, back to the ground before the water. Long before this was a lake, this was Forsyth County, and the valley the core would one day flood was farmland. Good farmland. A great deal of it was owned and worked by black families, landowners, as well as sharecroppers, people who had built farms and churches out of the red Georgia clay in the decades after the Civil War. Down near the river sat a little settlement people called Oscarville, with a store, a mill, a school, the ordinary bones of a southern community. In the nearby town of Gainesville, the county was becoming a center of agriculture, a place that would one day call itself the poultry capital of the world. The soil grew cotton and corn, and enough surplus to raise churches and pass land down to children. For a black family in the Deep South at the turn of the century, that kind of independence was rare and hard won. And here it was real, with their names on the deeds. This was a living valley, full of people who owned the ground they stood on. Then came the fall of 1912. In September of that year, a white woman named Ellen Grice said she had been assaulted. Days later, a young white woman named Mae Crow was found in the woods, badly beaten, and she died of her injuries within weeks. What followed was a hunt. A black man named Rob Edwards was dragged out of the county jail in Cumming by a mob, beaten, almost certainly shot, and his body was hung from a pole in the public square for the town to see. 2 black teenagers, Ernest Knox, who was 16, and Oscar Daniel, who was 17, were arrested, tried by an all-white jury, and sentenced in a matter of days. On the 25th of October, 1912, they were hanged. The crowd that gathered to watch 2 boys die was estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people. But the killings were not the end of it. They were the signal for something larger. Across that autumn, bands of white men known as night riders moved through Forsyth County, farm by farm, cabin by cabin. They burned barns. They fired shots into homes in the dark. They gave black families an ultimatum: leave or die. And so more than 1,000 people, by the count of the historian Patrick Phillips, roughly 98% of every black resident in the county, fled. They left in wagons and on foot. They left crops standing in the fields. They left livestock in the pens. They left the deeds to land. Their families had spent 50 years earning, And that land did not sit empty. Much of it passed straight into white hands, with no sale and no payment. The neighbors harvested the crops the fleeing families had planted. They took the animals. They moved onto the farms. An entire community's worth of property changed owners in a single season, without a dollar being exchanged, because the people who owned it had been driven off at gunpoint and told never to come back. And think about what that ground became. The same red clay those families were run off of sits today, under some of the most valuable lakefront property in the state of Georgia. $1 million docks, gated shorelines, summer homes an hour north of a booming city. The theft of 1912 did not cost those families only a season of standing crops and a few hundred head of livestock. It cost them 3 generations of inheritance, everything that land would ever come to be worth. Their great-grandchildren might have owned that shoreline. They were not allowed to set foot in the county at all. This is the part that reorders the whole story. Forsyth County did not open back up after that autumn. It closed and stayed closed. For the next 75 years, Black Americans did not live in Forsyth. They knew not to be caught there after dark. That autumn set a border, and the border held for 3 generations. So hold the timeline in order, because the order is the whole thing. The black families were driven off this land in 1912. The stolen farms were worked by others for decades. It was not until the 1950s, more than 40 years later, that the Army Corps of Engineers came to this same valley, built Buford Dam, and let the river rise. By the time the water came, the crime was already old. The people were already gone. The water rose over a valley that had been emptied by force 40 years earlier, its farms long since worked by other hands. It did not commit the crime here. It became the lid on top of it. The water came last. You will hear people say, the lake drowned Oscarville, the black town, as if the town and its people went under together. They did not. By the time the water rose in the 1950s, the black families who had farmed that riverbank were more than 40 years gone, their land long since in other hands. What the water covered was the ground the night riders had emptied by force. That is the truth almost every telling of this place leaves out. And when it came, the water took the graves. As the lake filled, roughly 20 cemeteries lay in its path. The Corps worked to move what they could. Hundreds of burials were dug up and carried to higher ground and reburied in other churchyards. Whole congregations were moved. The dead of Spencer Hill were carried to Union Baptist over in Buford. Family plots along Shoal Creek and Island Ford were lifted out of the earth and set down again on ground the water would not reach. But moving a grave required permission. And where a family could not be found, scattered as so many had been, or where a family said no, the graves were left where they lay. The headstones stayed standing, the water rose over them. To this day, no one can give a full accounting of how many people are still down there in the dark, under the boat traffic, in ground, no one ever agreed to disturb. People around here have a harder name for this lake. They call it a crime scene that somebody filled with water. Once you know the order of what happened on this ground, the name is difficult to argue with, and it is not the kind of thing the tourism board will ever print on a sign. I want to be honest with you here, because this water does give something back, and the people who defend it are not wrong to say so. The dam controls floods that used to ruin the towns downstream. The lake supplies drinking water to millions of people in metro Atlanta. No one built it out of malice. It was built the way most of these southern reservoirs were built, by an agency doing what it was told, in a valley whose original sin had been committed long before any engineer arrived. That is the weight of it. The injustice was already in the ground. The dam only sealed it in and put a marina over the top. The families who were driven out never saw a cent of what that shoreline became, and their descendants, for 3 generations, were not even allowed to drive through the county to look at it. Which brings us back to the word that draws so many people to this story: unexplained. People search for that word because they cannot understand how a place this ordinary, a place families drive to for the 4th of July, keeps taking people year after year and holds what it takes for 32 years at a time. They reach for hauntings because the plain answer is harder to sit with. The plain answer is deep, cold, blinding water, poured over a drowned landscape of roads and roofs and standing timber, crowded past any other lake in the state, sitting on ground where a whole community was murdered and driven off and never made right. The state's own people have done that math. Measured against the sheer number of visitors who come here, Lanier runs about 1.1/5 deaths for every million people who use it. That is roughly double the calmest lake in Georgia, not 100 times more. The lake is crowded past any other in the state, and it sits on top of a drowned town, in water you cannot see your hand in. That is the whole of the mystery, and it is enough to explain every summer it takes. Cold water, bad footing under the surface, a drowned world in the dark, and on the land around it, a history the county spent 75 years trying not to look at. And Forsyth County did eventually have to face that history out loud, in front of the whole country. In January of 1987, a small group of about 75 civil rights marchers, led by Hosea Williams, tried to walk peacefully through the county to challenge its reputation. A white mob drove them back with rocks and slurs. So they came back. A week later, they returned in numbers no one could turn away. Somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people marched through Forsyth County, guarded by 2,500 law officers and the National Guard. Coretta Scott King walked, Andrew Young walked, John Lewis walked. It took an army to let Americans walk in peace through a county that another kind of mob had emptied by force, 75 years before, over the same ground that now lies under the lake. It took until then, until 1987, for the country to look straight at Forsyth County and say out loud what had been done there. 3/4 of a century of silence, broken by 20,000 pairs of feet on a county road. And even now, the lake keeps most of it. The graves are still down there in the dark. The names of the two boys hanged in the square are on almost no map anyone drives past. And the water goes on being beautiful, which may be the hardest part of all to sit with. So the next time you see a photograph of Lake Lanier, the boats, the bright water, the families on the shore, try to see the whole of it. See the racetrack grandstand under the surface, see the roadbeds and the drowned trees, see the graves no one moved, and then look back past the water entirely, to the farms that were stolen, the men hanged in the square, the 1,000 people who walked away from everything they owned and were told never to return. The lake did not do that. It is only the last thing that happened here, the water that came in at the end and covered the rest. That is why it will not stop taking people, and why it always seems to know something the people on top of it do not. The crime came first, the water came last, and it is all still down there. If these are the stories you want, the drowned valleys of the South told the way they actually happened, and with respect for the people they happened to, then walk with me. A great deal more of the South is underwater than anyone thinks, and every drowned valley of it remembers.